out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week is going to be the turn of Lloyd James, currently the front man with Crisis, but has been in lots of other bands before that moment, including Naevus, and also had a moment here with Soul Invictus. So this is the interview. You'll find out lots more about his life, so I won't bore you with the intros. So after several minutes of interest and a casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years. Lloyd, it's over to you.
Yes, actually, I suppose really for me, because I was born in 1975, so I kind of missed out on a lot of the acts you mentioned at that particular point in time. But for me, it was really, I suppose, the mid to late 80s when things like the Smiths were around. That really sort of caught my attention when I first heard them on the radio. And in my sort of teenage years, I was a bit of a goth, basically. So I remember when I first heard things like The Mission and Susie and the Banshees on the chart show. I was completely sort of blown away by that. Like, I couldn't understand, what is this form of music, you know?
Yes.
So I got very into that. And then from that kind of music, I then got into bands like Magazine and so on. And that was a big sort of changing thing for me, discovering bands from probably about 10 years before my sort of time. And
Yes.
Bands like Magazine and Wire, etc., and Joy Division. I was very into that sort of stuff. But also at the same time, there was sort of some bands around sort of at that time I was quite into. Bands like The Wedding Present, I was very keen on. Who obviously very much fit into that C86 sort of area. Yeah.
Yes, he says, laughing hysterically. Well, did you see the film that they made a few years ago on George Best, the album, which was quite a nice little kind of indie film that came out? And,
I haven't seen it yet. I would like to see it. I'm aware of it, but I've not actually had a chance to actually see it yet. But...
Yes, it's surprisingly bizarre. Well, it's interesting that there was a lot of issues around the drummer. There was a big thing between the drummer and the producer, and and you know, being an indie kid from that period, I just thought everybody just thrashed around, and it wasn't too worried about being that clinical. But on this particular experience, it was actually, and the poor old drummer had to go. But then I spoke to quite a few drummers in the last 5-10 years, and there's been a lot of trauma actually, and ending up in homelessness and drug addiction. So being a drummer is not always that easy. So
well, I'm sure. No, I mean, I started out as a drummer actually in bands initially, but and I still love playing drums, but I'm just not very good at it, unfortunately. But I would like to be doing it more, but I just, you know.
And did you have a musical family? Did they encourage your musical direction at all?
To an extent, they were quite into music, not in a big way. My sister was very musical. It is. I mean, she now lectures in music. She's a saxophonist. But I was never really went down that route because I just wanted to sort of I wanted to play drums. But at school at that time, drums weren't really considered a proper instrument. So even though every lunchtime at school, I'd be in the music room. Playing music with some school friends, but I was deemed as not being sort of, you know, playing a suitable instrument to be in the top set for my music lessons at school. So that kind of put me off music education for a while.
I was crushing.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. I mean, thankfully that's been improved now a bit. With I think the education world has caught up in a lot of ways with things like electric guitar, bass, and drums being accepted as a legitimate musical instrument to learn.
Yes, but so before we get to Crisis then, but you have a whole musical world before joining the sort of the Brighton based band, don't you? So
I played in a few bands at school. I played drums and tried to write lyrics and so on, but didn't really get very far with that. It was really just a sort of a hobby. And then round about the mid 90s, when I'd moved to London, I started to sort of try and put together a band, and it was very much part of the sort of DIY scene that sort of existed at that time around kind of industrial and related sorts of music. It was very kind of inspiring because I liked the fact there was still this fanzine and sort of tape trading culture going on. You know, it felt very democratic, and you know, it was a great sort of little sort of period of time where people could still sort of make a demo tape, you know, and sell it to you in the post for like £2.50, where you'd send off a coin, sell a tape to a bit of card, you know. And I thought those times were really good because it really was open to everyone, and the fanzines were very kind of inclusive about stuff.
Yes. And then sort of, so when you got to that golden age of 16, 18, did you leave school and go to college, university, or did you sort of go into trying to be in a band?
Oh no, well I left Wales when I was 17 or 18. I went to university in London, and then during my time at university, I was trying to kind of get a band together with one of my flatmates and my girlfriend at the time, and we eventually succeeded. But it was a learning process, you know.
Yes, that time. So this is the John Major years, wasn't it? Britpop was at its height.
Yeah, yes, Britpop was at its height, and even though I liked some of it, I felt very kind of like on the opposite side of things from that, you know, because you still had things like you know, Oasis and Blur sort of having this false feud in the media and so on. Whereas outside of that, there was an awful lot of very interesting sort of independent music going on, you know. I mean, other bands I liked at that sort of time who were going along alongside that. I really loved Gallon Drunk, you know. They were one of the best live bands I've ever seen. I'd go and see them live regularly. It's a band called Moonshake I was a big fan of. I don't know if you recall them. They were a great band. It was a band that was put together by the former singer of the Wolfhounds.
Yes, was that Dave Callahan?
Callahan, yes, yeah. And I thought Moonshine were a really interesting group because they weren't just sort of guitar centric, had interesting rhythms and so on. But yeah, I was into that sort of stuff. There was a band called Pram. I think they were very good as well around that time.
Yes, were they on two Pure Records, Pram?
Yeah, I think they were. I think they were from Birmingham and they were on 2 Pure.
Yeah, I just seem to remember. I'm always very excited. I suppose those 2 decades were particularly interesting for sort of bands, labels, venues as well. There seemed to be a sort of a bit of a golden period. And like you said, fanzines as well. And thankfully, people are now writing books and bringing out films of that decade or those decades, which I think is just marvelous for people like me who likes to sit in and watch documentaries on the Newtown neurotics and stuff like that. That's quality viewing. So that's all good. So your first band, this is with Joanne Owen.
That's right, yeah.
This was the band that sort of launched your kind of musical world.
Well, yeah, I mean, it started out, we had a little band before then, which just made a few demo tapes, and it sounded atrocious, to be honest. But then after that, we decided, okay, we've made some few mistakes here. We know what we want to do. And it was that wonderful period of time where home recording equipment had just become that right balance between affordable and not rubbish. So you actually could, in your own home, record something of CD quality. And also at that time, you could actually go and get CDs pressed directly yourself at a relatively affordable price at a time when people still bought CDs. So it was just that perfect balance, really. So I think we really benefited from that. So
yes.
So we had a band called Naevus, which still exists to this day, actually. But and we hadn't played any gigs or anything, but I just decided, right, I want to make an album. So I took out a bank loan under false pretenses, and just to get the equipment needed, just to get this album recorded. And I didn't think there'd be any audience for it whatsoever. I really thought it would go nowhere. We were quite fortunate in that a friend of a friend worked at a professional recording studio. So we snuck in at night on Madness's downtime when they were recording an album to actually get the thing mastered and put it out. And luckily, a distributor in Italy heard it and bought all the copies off me. So that was quite a relief.
My God, that's great, isn't it? Because I've often found that a lot of bands have a country that takes them to heart. Actually, there was I think it was Shelly Ann Orphan from the 80s, and Italy, apparently they're big in Italy. And,
yeah, well, this is it. I mean, I suppose certain bands seem to resonate there a bit. And I think with Naevus, it really sort of seemed to catch on in Italy and Germany initially, at least, you know.
Yes. And was that recorded at the Engine Room in London with Mark Bishop? Was he the engineer?
Mark Bishop wasn't the recording engineer, but he did help us get the thing mastered. So he actually did the mastering. Probably shouldn't say this because I think he did it a bit cheekily, but he did it sort of when he really probably shouldn't have been doing it. But it was very good. It's quite exciting to actually be into a professional recording studio for the first time and actually, you know, be in that environment was quite a interesting thing.
Yes, there's quite a few bands who've had to sort of go in at night and just spend, you know, that was the only time they were going to be able to record their album. And then was a Liverpool band called It's Immaterial that had gone to America to record an album with a, you know, named producer. I think a member of Talking Heads, but they really hated it, but they had to go along with it. And then in the evening when he went home, they recorded what they wanted and then used that recording rather than this professional one that was being done during the day, which sounded completely bonkers. But
Yes,
you know,
yeah.
they got what they wanted. So I think you have to duck and dive, really, don't you? And
absolutely, yeah.
You know, in this world. So when that album came out, then you had quite a following.
Well, initially it was just Into a Void, and a lot of people had recommended that I don't do it because I thought it sounded quite strange. I didn't really know what sort of music it was, and I was probably quite, you know, awkward about the artwork. I had an idea for the artwork. I wanted just a completely plain green sleeve, you know. But I was just very fortunate. There was just the guy from Ender Records in Italy just heard it and liked it, and he then, you know, sent a few copies to other people who liked it and sort of promoted it and stuck up for it. So it was quite fortunate it caught on. I mean, at the time, I didn't really know what sort of music it was, but we immediately got comparisons to other groups I hadn't really listened to that much before. And so we got kind of pigeonholed a bit in a way that I hadn't expected. But it was still useful to have a scene that will actually take you in as part of it, you know?
Yes, well, absolutely. I think in that C86 world, no one wanted to be on that cassette, but then we're very grateful that they were on that cassette because then it meant that, you know, the kids at the time slightly, you know, would have come across those other bands that they probably wouldn't have done otherwise. And bands that said they didn't want to be on the cassette really regretted it afterwards because they thought, oh God, we just shot ourselves in the foot. The joys of youth, really. But you know, like a lot of bands, they have that 5-year narrative, don't they? And you know, you obviously were very productive during that period, weren't you?
I think we had a very productive, probably about 10 years maybe. So we did a series of albums quite quickly. I mean, we weren't playing an awful lot of gigs. We would just do periodic trips over to Europe, really, for gigs. But gigs in the UK were normally much smaller than ones in Europe.
Yes.
But at the time, both Joanne and I really enjoyed. You know, we were both kind of Europhiles, really. So we just loved being able to go abroad, meet some nice people, have some nice food, have a little holiday. It was great.
And then did you sort of also flirt with other bands as well and sort of find yourself guesting on other albums?
Yes, I've done that a bit. I mean, I suppose the first time I did that, I did some things like I did some vocals for this Italian electronic band called Curly and Camera, who again in the UK people haven't really heard of that much, but they were hugely popular in Germany and Italy. And what else have I done? I briefly played in a few other groups. I played with Son Invictus briefly on a couple of occasions, which is how I got to know Tony Wakeford from Crisis.
Yes.
And I also, for about 16 years, I played drums for Rose McDowell, you know, formerly of Strawberry Switchblade. And that was great, actually. It was really enjoyable time in that band.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
God, Rose. My God, what a band. What a sound. What a scene. Yeah, God.
She's amazing. I mean, Rose has an absolutely wonderful voice. Her voice is just incredible. And she's a lovely person. And I was very pleased to get her onto a Naevus album, actually, for some extra vocals. That was very good.
Yes. And then how did Crisis, this kind of band from the mid to late 70s, come into your life?
Well, I suppose it was around about I think about 2015 or 16, because I was a fan of Crisis. I kind of they're kind of one of those bands I always found really fascinating because the music was sort of right up my street. You know, it was kind of like a slightly messier version of Wire or Gang of Four in places, you know, but it had these kind of vocals on them which were incredibly direct, lyrically, just basically political hectoring, you know, in terms of the lyrics, but sort of delivered in this almost kind of oi type voice, which seemed at
Yes.
odds with the music. So I always found that kind of that kind of tension in the music quite interesting. So I was a fan of them anyway, and you know I was quite interested when I first met Tony Wakeford. I was more, to be honest, I was more impressed by the fact he was in Crisis than the fact he'd been in all these other groups. But so I'd been to see this group called 1984, which consisted of Tony and Clive and a couple of different drummers at different times, and they were just playing a set consisting of mostly old Crisis material. And I thought, well, I've got to see this band. You know, I never thought I'd get to hear these songs played live. So I saw them play a few times, and I think we even did a few gigs together with my own band Naevus playing with them. And then I think what happened was they were playing some gigs in Italy, and against their wishes, the promoters kept billing the concerts as Crisis rather than
Right.
1984. So I think eventually Tony and Clive just thought, well, look, we can't stop them doing this. We may as well just call it Crisis. And so at that point, they decided to get in a singer. And I think they also approached one of the original drummers from the band, Luke Rendell. And he was originally going to be drumming in the version of the band I joined. But I think that didn't work out for reasons I'm not sure about. So we ended up with a band which consisted of Clive, Tony, and I, plus Igor on drums who would come in. So it was a bit odd because it's a bit strange having only one original member of the group in the band. But having
Yes.
said that, I suppose, you know, given that the band even back in the 70s had a series of drummers and a series of singers anyways, I suppose it's just in that same trajectory.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting one because I sort of a few years ago, obviously being slightly older, but was a little bit curious with some of my 70s bands that I didn't particularly like, but they were on the radio, like the Rubettes and Shawaddy Waddy and the Bay City Rollers. And so I sort of managed to interview quite a few of these people just to find out more. And then I sort of realized, I think there was like 4 versions of the Rubettes. I thought that's amazing, actually. And I think there were 2 versions of the Bay City Rollers at one stage. So it was, you know, and I think there's 2 versions of Berkeley James Harvest as well, which is kind of, so I think it's kind of interesting. But then when we listen to classical music, obviously the composer and everybody who originally recorded, well, you know, played those songs are long gone. So, you know, it's interesting that kind of ownership of who really, you know, has the real essence of a band. And I think when there was the first tribute bands, it all seemed really peculiar. But I think slowly over time, we begin to relax on that slightly, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, I do find it a little odd. I mean, to be perfectly honest, even though I love singing the old Crisis songs live, because they're great songs, I always love them, some in particular, but I probably do enjoy more doing our new material. And we're being quite lucky, and that seems to be going down quite well with audiences. We haven't had any complaints I'm aware of anyway. But I'm really happy with the songs we've developed since 2017.
Yes, you've been very prolific actually. Having new members, does that sort of help the, you know, Tony and his kind of direction of the band and a bit of enthusiasm? Because most indie bands, even with the original members, don't really want to reform just to play their old hits. Because I think I don't.
Well, I think to be honest, I think what's really helped with this version of Crisis is that the band lineup we have now, which is Tony and Clive and myself, plus Laura on drums. It's just a really good fit personally, you know. I think we just get on and we have fun, and it's just fun and funny to actually play, and we just really enjoy it, you know. So I think even if we didn't have gigs to do, we'd probably still be doing rehearsals because it's just if we just enjoy it, you know.
Yes.
So I think it's you know it's very hard to find a band with the right mix of personalities. And I think in Crisis now, everyone's quite different, but complements each other in such a way that it just works fine. You know, we've never had any fallings out or anything. It's all been very easy, which is unusual for most bands, I think.
Yes. Well, I think a few people have, who were the kind of essence of a band would like, after that period, then, the post band period, sort of think, I'd like to play music again. I like to I wrote those songs, so in a way I feel like I should play them. But the relationship with the other members of the band is such that it's not going to take much for the whole thing to explode again, and all the issues that happened the first time, even if it was 20 or 30 years ago, are still going to surface. So it's almost easier to start with afresh, but with the member who probably was the creative driving force of a band, and then it can sort of morph and change. And I think that probably is a lot easier, unless you can all just get on. But let's face it, we're human beings.
It's just difficult. And also as well, I mean, people's lives just change, and some people want to be playing in a band for a period of time, and after a certain point in time, maybe their life changes, their priorities change, and they just don't want to do it anymore. So you have to get someone else in at that point,
Yes. And how do you, and with fans who obviously go back decades with the band, how do they sort of relate to the kind of changes in the lineup and the new material?
Well, I was very apprehensive about that at first. I thought, I'd see a bit of a resistance to me singing with Crisis. But the first gig I did with them, which I think was October 2017, I think, and was actually in Guildford, where Crisis are from originally. So I was quite nervous about that. And then when I arrived at the venue, the original singer, Fraser, was in the audience. And but actually, as it turns out, he was a very nice chap. I had a nice chat with him. He had some words of encouragement for me, and I actually came up and sang one song as well. So that was good. But I was a bit nervous about how some of the old sort of hardcore Crisis fans from back in the 70s would respond. And I do remember being a bit nervous at one point in the set when a very large, tall, big, bald chap was picked up one of the crash barriers, looked like he was about to throw it at me. But I found out later he was just doing that out of exuberance rather than
anger. What a relief! Yes, it's kind of interesting, because I think I was a drummer called Jamie Oliver, not the other Jamie Oliver, and he'd been in a lot of punk bands, and found that I think it was UK subs, and there was a sort of element who were quite nationalistic, and he posted something which didn't go well and was kind of asked to leave the band. So it's kind of often, we live in these tricky times, don't we? We have to be very careful.
I think those issues were difficult with Crisis, because even though they were obviously very much a socialist group, with various forms of Marxists and other kinds of socialists in the group, who probably didn't all agree between each other at the time anyway, back in the 70s. Even though they were very much a political anti-racist group, in the 70s, they still nevertheless seemed to attract a certain kind of right-wing following as well as a left-wing following. So I think their gigs in the 70s tended to be quite violent. I'm glad to say they're not anymore.
Yeah,
but I've not seen any of that in my time in the band anyway.
So. Well, no, that would just be unpleasant, wouldn't it, and unreasonable. So with because I noticed that you've got a single, and I was just listening to it, Escalator, that came out 2 years ago, didn't it, on Wooden Lung Records? That was an EP. Yeah. Is it the case that I know you've got some dates next year. Have you got more material that you're looking to record over the winter and release next year?
Yes, we've got a few new songs. I mean, what we hope to do is do probably a mini album, possibly another EP. So we want to get 5 or 6 or 7 songs. We've got some rehearsals booked in to get those sort of fine-tuning on some new songs done in November. Then in December, we've got some studio time booked to get a pile of those recorded.
Yes. And is it the case that, with the John Peel session that came out in 78, only 45 years ago, is that ever going to be released as a sort of a proper EP or single or anything like that?
Well, I doubt it, because basically it's been quite commonly available for years anyway, because the Crisis singles that came out, their second and third singles, they are just the Peel sessions, because one of the members of Crisis at the time, just after they recorded their Peel session, I think they bought the tape of it off the BBC directly for quite a reasonable sum, because they worked out it would actually be cheaper to do that than record the songs again.
Yes.
So I think Crisis have actually owned those recordings since probably 1978, 79.
Yes. And with your other musical, because you've got your other musical project, is that still also an ongoing concern?
Well, Naevus is an ongoing concern still, but it has slowed down somewhat, basically because I've had a bit of a writer's block for the last year and a half. But apart from that, we've actually got an album that's mostly finished, but just got 3 more songs that I need to write lyrics for. But I've not had much joy in coming up with suitable words for that. So I don't want to force it. I'd rather let it happen as it should do.
So because I was listening to Setbacks, is that going to be a track on the new album?
That was the plan. And it may well still be, actually. I think if it does end up on the next album, it may be in a slightly different mix. But the plan is for that to be on the next album. However, at the moment, I'm thinking I'm not going to rush anything. I may even take some of the other recordings and issue them as an EP. But yes, I want to wait until I'm comfortable with a whole set of pieces to put together, before another album comes out. I don't want to force it. Yeah.
Yes, God, I know the joy of creativity is quite a hard one. What's the story? Because I was listening to the song and reading the lyrics of Her Simple Story in an Aircraft Strap. Where did that inspiration come from?
Well, actually, this might sort of scupper it a bit, I suppose. But it was actually written during the first lockdown, start of 2020, and I basically saved up a pile of crossword clues from cryptic crosswords and kind of mangled them all up together, and then just kept remangling them and reordering them until I could sort of sentences began to form, and I could then turn them into, and then until a kind of a sort of narrative started to appear.
Yes,
and that's something I like to do quite a lot. Is just sort of jumble stuff up until you almost start to imagine a story in it, and then focus on those bits, and then just try and keep it there. So a story is implied, but it's not actually really saying anything.
It's right. So the Frenchman took a trip for a binder of lies.
I mean, all of those things don't have any precise meaning at the point they were written, but they're the kind of thing you can hear, and then your brain tries to make sense of it in context. So it just happens to sort of, it sounds like some kind of tale of espionage or something.
Yes, yes, I know. That's what I was thinking. Because actually, being a David Bowie fan, obviously we all saw him with his big scissors cutting up, lyrics into lines and then putting them in a jumble and then sort of seeing what came out. So do you also use that kind of cutout technique at times when you're finding it particularly difficult to sort of work out what you're going to try?
I mean, I love using those techniques anyway. I mean, and not just for words as well, but there's a few other musical projects I've been involved in over the years, which are more sort of abstract, sort of experimental instrumental music. And for those, I very much like applying kind of aleatory sort of methods to composing things. So you'll just randomize some numbers somehow,
yes,
and then turn those into a set of parameters for something, and then try and operate within that, if that makes any sense. So I kind of like pieces of music which are composed in that kind of way,
And do you ever sort of write with other people, or do you write on your own and then bring the music to the lyrics later?
Lyric-wise, I don't think I've done much writing with other people. I'd find that really hard, because I think with words, I get very precious about them, and it has to be just me. But with music, no, I very much enjoy sort of, creating stuff with other people.
Yes.
I mean, part of the real fun of being in a band is having a bit of an idea, or somebody else has a bit of an idea, and then somebody else adds to it, and someone else changes it a bit, and next thing you know, you've got a great bit of music which is created by not one person, but by everyone together. You know, it's a good feeling, and I think that's one of the nicest things about being in a band.
Yes, well, I always thought Bowie at some of his periods, especially the 70s, had that kind of magic realism to it, which was, you know, it was all very abstract, but the lyrics, those lines just had that kind of, yes, that's a great line. I'm not sure what it means, but it sort of fits in with the rest of the song. And it's, you know, but I often wonder what it would be like, what it's like for a creative person trying to create a song, because we often hear those classics, you wonder why they are classics, whereas a lot of songs are, you know, just like, well, they're okay, they've got all the bits, but that hasn't given it something slightly magical, which kind of...
it's difficult. I mean, I suppose in the kind of more odd bits of lyric writing I've done, like mainly for the earlier stuff at Naevus, there's an element in that which people tend to sort of tend to describe as maybe surreal or something, but I wouldn't say it's surreal. But I would say there's probably an influence there from, I mean, I suppose a lot of my favorite writers are writers of prose from Central Europe, really, you know, and so I think there's an element of this kind of the absurd, but also being part of an observation, you know. So I kind of tend to sort of do that kind of stuff habitually, really.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you could have whispered something to your 16-year-old self starting out in this creative journey, is there anything in particular that you've discovered in the last X amount of decades that you think, oh, that would have been a really good thing to have known when I was a bit younger?
I would have told him, for God's sake, learn to play guitar. Because I had to learn it much later in life, and it's a pain then. But if I was 16 and I'd been able to play guitar or a keyboard, it would have been much easier, much earlier for me to then go and document and put across any musical ideas I had. Whereas I was trying to do that by just using a drum machine and you know, just trying to persuade people.
Yes.
But just having those basic skills with a versatile instrument. Because when I was very young, I learned drums a bit. I learned to play trombone a little bit and violin. But in terms of working together with a band in a kind of a popular music sort of idiom, just having guitar or keyboard skills is just so useful.
Yes, it would have been cool, because you obviously with your band, it's often referred to as neo folk, isn't it? Which is a strange label. Do you feel a bit uncomfortable with that kind of?
Yeah, very. I don't like that at all. I mean, I've nothing against folk music. I like a lot of folk music, but the stuff I do really isn't folk music. It's very modernist music, I suppose, really. But it just, I suppose, because it happens to have an acoustic guitar, and I've got a relatively deep voice, and there are other groups in that area, you know, who get called neo folk, and I suppose there's a surface similarity in some of the sounds, you know, with the acoustic guitar, and because I've done music with some people from that area as well, so I suppose that's it. I mean, I don't really mind having that label, but I just don't think it applies to Naevus, really.
No. And does with either band, have you done much touring abroad, either in Europe or America?
Yes, I think with Naevus, we probably play most of our gigs abroad. That's where we tend to sort of get more interest.
Yes.
And I love to do that. You know, we've you know, I've also been very fortunate as well with just how much I've got to travel with Naevus. You know, I mean, just doing things like a little mini tour I did once, entirely solo set, played in far north of Norway one day, and then the following day I was playing in Odessa in Ukraine, you know, having not slept in between gigs, you know, and just to have that chance to actually travel and see just contrasting parts of Europe in that way was really enjoyable.
Yeah, because there's a few bands from that period, like Sad Lovers and Giants, Snake Corpse. There was another one, and also The Trees, which are much bigger in Europe. You know, they reform for Europe, do a couple of dates there, and that's like, oh well, we'll just come home. We're not even going to bother with the UK. So it's kind of interesting that your band has also got a similar path.
Yeah, I mean, and also The Trees actually. I mean, do like, well, I have actually met a couple of them once or twice. Very nice chaps. But yeah, I can see actually how someone could bracket Naevus in the same category as them, whatever that category is, I don't know. But I can see there's possibly some similarity there. And again, so I can understand how, yeah, you have a similar kind of audience for that sort of stuff in mainland Europe.
I think I sort of would definitely wouldn't mention neo folk. I kind of think I find it sort of more sophisticated pop. Really, it's slightly more something quite. There's a gravitas to those bands, which you wouldn't get with. We've got a fuzz box and we're going to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Or the wedding present, really. But
Indeed.
but there's a sort of like, God, these guys probably read a lot.
Yeah. But having said that, I think with a band like the Wedding Present, I mean, some of that has real gravitas, but in an emotional sense. Because I mean, some of the songs on Bizarro, their second album, there's some really heart-wrenching emotional lines on there and the way it's delivered, And obviously David Gedge is a literate man, He knows how to craft a phrase, doesn't he?
So, absolutely. And with because I know in Las Vegas they've got the punk rock museum, and they also have a punk bowling weekend. Have you ever sort of been asked to play or do anything in that kind of vicinity in the USA?
We have had offers for some gigs in the US and Canada, but it's just never really proven possible for a combination of reasons, mainly financial ones, and also some visa reasons I probably can't go into. But so I don't think a tour of America is going to be on the cards, really. Possibly Canada. That might still happen.
Yes.
But also as well, I mean, our glorious leader, Tony Wakeford, who's the main sort of songwriter and founder of Crisis, he doesn't like to travel too much these days. He's a little bit older than the rest of us in the group, and he's got a few little health issues, which keep him from being able to travel as freely as he might like to. So we're not going to be doing a huge amount of gigs or lengthy tours anytime soon.
And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. Massive thank you, as always, to Lloyd James for giving me the time for that. If you want to find out any more information, various Bandcamp pages are a good place to start, especially Naevus and also Crisis. So do check them out. And I think Soul Invictus is on Spotify, and probably Crisis is as well. So there you go. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 Show. All these interviews have been archived. You can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Have a great week. Stay safe.